My wife cheated on me with my boss, now I run the company he lost. I'm going to tell you this the way I'd tell it to a friend over coffee, not like I'm trying to sound clever or dramatic, because when something like this happens, you don't experience it in cinematic moments. You experience it in details that feel painfully ordinary: the sound of a door closing behind you, the smell of your own house when you come back earlier than planned, the weight of your phone in your hand when you realize you're about to learn something that will quietly split your life in two. My name is Michael Harris. I was 42 years old when this started, and at that point in my life, I believed I had already passed the dangerous part. I worked in operations for a mid-sized logistics company called Midwest Logistics Solutions, the kind of company most people never think about, even though half the things they buy pass through places like ours. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was stable. Predictable. The kind of job that lets you sleep at night because problems are solved before they become emergencies. My wife Emily and I had been together for almost 20 years. We met in college, back when we were both broke enough to confuse potential with certainty. I noticed her on the first day, but it took me half a year to actually speak to her. When I finally did, at a messy dorm party with cheap punch and loud music, the conversation felt effortless, like something that had been waiting to happen. She could talk about anything without trying to impress anyone, and back then, that felt rare. We got married 2 years later. A year after that, our daughter Sophie was born. The years that followed were steady in the way people secretly hope for but rarely talk about. Family dinners around the same kitchen table. Friday nights reserved for just the two of us, usually at the same Italian restaurant we both loved because it felt familiar and safe. Vacations when work allowed. A house we upgraded slowly as our income grew. Better furniture. Better wine. Fewer worries. I didn't think of myself as lucky. I thought of myself as settled. The week everything fell apart started like any other. I had a business trip scheduled for 7 days, meetings, site visits, conversations that all blurred together after a while. I finished earlier than expected and booked an earlier flight home without telling Emily. There was no strategy behind it. I just liked the idea of showing up unannounced, of reminding myself that surprises still existed in our lives. Before going home, I stopped by the office to drop off paperwork and let my boss know I was back. His name was Daniel Wright. He was 35, sharp, intense, and deeply invested in the company's performance. He carried himself like someone who had built everything from the ground up, and I never had a reason to question that. I respected him. I trusted him. He wasn't just my boss, he was the person who had influence over my future. He wasn't in his office. That should have meant nothing. People step out. Meetings run late. But something about it stuck with me, mostly because Daniel was never unpredictable. I left the documents with his assistant and drove home, already pushing the thought aside. On the way, I stopped at a grocery store and bought flowers for Emily. Nothing extravagant. Just something that said, without words, that I had thought about her. Looking back, it feels almost cruel how normal that decision was. When I opened the front door, the house was quiet. Emily wasn't in the kitchen like she usually was, working on her laptop with a half-finished cup of coffee. Sophie had left a note on the fridge saying she'd gone out with friends and would be back later. I told myself Emily must have stepped out briefly. Coffee. Groceries. Something ordinary. I ordered dinner for the three of us and opened a bottle of wine I'd brought back from a previous trip. I set the table and waited. Sophie came home first. She was genuinely happy to see me, the kind of reaction that reminds you what honesty looks like before people learn how to hide it. We talked briefly about her day. Then she disappeared into her room, and the house settled back into silence. Emily didn't come home. I waited longer than I should have, partly because I didn't want to ruin the surprise, and partly because I didn't want to admit that something felt wrong. When I finally called her, her voice sounded normal. Casual. Almost too casual. She said she was out, that she didn't feel like sitting at home alone, that she'd call me in the morning. Under different circumstances, I would have believed her without hesitation. What I couldn't ignore was another voice in the background. Low. Male. Close enough to feel familiar even through the phone. The call ended quickly, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than any argument we'd ever had. I stood in the kitchen holding my phone, trying to convince myself I was overreacting. That it meant nothing. That it could be explained. But my body didn't believe that story, and sometimes your body understands the truth before your mind is ready to accept it. 2 weeks earlier, Emily had lost her phone and was temporarily using an old one that belonged to our daughter. That phone still had location sharing enabled. I had never used it to track her before, and part of me hated myself for opening the app at all. Another part of me knew I wouldn't sleep until I did. The dot on the map wasn't at a bar. It was at our Italian restaurant. The one tied to anniversaries, birthdays, and quiet conversations about the future. The place that had never meant anything other than us. Something inside me went very still. I drove there without thinking much about how or why. I parked far enough away that my car wouldn't be recognized and walked the rest of the distance on autopilot. I knew exactly where Emily would be sitting. She always chose the table by the window, the one that let her watch the street while pretending it couldn't see her. From across the street, I saw everything I needed to see. Emily was there, wearing a yellow dress she saved for important occasions. Across from her sat Daniel Wright. My boss. His jacket was off, his posture relaxed in a way I had never seen at work. They were holding hands, not tentatively, not accidentally, but comfortably. When she leaned forward and kissed him, something inside me closed. Not shattered. Not screaming. Just closed. I raised my phone and took a photo without thinking. Then another. The images weren't perfect, but they were clear enough. Proof has a way of grounding reality when your mind wants to pretend none of this is happening. As I stood there, trying to understand how 2 decades of my life could collapse into a single moment, I became aware that I wasn't alone. A woman stood a few feet away, frozen in the same position, staring through the same window. It was Laura Wright. Daniel's wife. I recognized the shock in her posture immediately, because it mirrored my own. 2 people, strangers in any meaningful sense, connected by the exact same realization at the exact same moment. I understood then that this wouldn't end with a conversation or a confession. It would end with consequences. I didn't go home right away that night. Not because I was lost, but because I understood that once I crossed that door again, I would be stepping back into a version of my life that no longer existed. I walked for nearly an hour, letting the cold air slow my thoughts, moving through streets I'd driven 100 times without ever really seeing. Shock does something strange to you, it narrows your focus. Emotions don't disappear, but they line up and wait their turn. When I finally returned, the house was dark. Emily wasn't there yet. I didn't leave a note. I didn't check the time. I took off my jacket, placed my keys in the same ceramic bowl by the door, and went to bed. The empty side of the mattress felt heavier than it ever had. Sleep didn't come, but rest did in a different form. By the time morning light slipped through the blinds, I had made a decision that surprised me with how calm it felt. I wasn't going to confront her. Not yet. The days that followed were defined by restraint. Emily acted exactly as she always had. She asked about my trip. She mentioned being tired. She moved through the house with the ease of someone who believed the ground beneath her was solid. Watching her do that was more unsettling than anger would have been. It showed me how practiced this life had become, how routine had made room for dishonesty without friction. At work, Daniel was the same man he'd always been. Focused. Demanding. Confident. He spoke to me about deadlines and contracts, trusted me with decisions that affected entire departments, and never once behaved like someone who felt exposed. That was when I understood how deep this went. This wasn't recklessness. This was certainty. The kind that grows when people believe there will never be consequences. I started noticing patterns I had ignored before. Emily's late nights aligned too neatly with my business travel. Daniel's off-site meetings left gaps that no calendar could reasonably justify. I didn't spy. I didn't snoop. I just stopped filling in the blanks with optimism. Once you remove assumption, facts arrange themselves. Laura reached out a few days later. Not with panic or tears, but with information. She had been paying attention longer than I had. Receipts that didn't make sense. Charges from restaurants printed too late to be professional meetings. Small lifestyle changes that would have seemed harmless on their own, but together painted a clear picture. She had doubted herself for months, because doubting your marriage feels more dangerous than doubting your instincts. What surprised me most was her composure. Hurt was there, but it wasn't driving the process. She had already crossed the emotional threshold I was still approaching. Where I was processing loss, she was measuring outcomes. That was when I learned the truth about the company. Midwest Logistics Solutions wasn't Daniel's creation. It had been founded decades earlier by Laura's father, a man who valued continuity over ego. When he stepped back, he didn't hand the company to his daughter outright. Instead, he placed Daniel in charge, believing he was securing stability for her by entrusting operations to someone he thought was loyal. On paper, Daniel ran everything. In reality, ownership lived elsewhere, tied to agreements and trust rather than entitlement. That knowledge changed the shape of everything. For the first time since that night at the restaurant, the situation stopped feeling one-sided. Daniel wasn't just risking his marriage. He was gambling with authority he didn't truly own. And people who confuse access with ownership tend to overplay their hand. Living with Emily during that period was a test of control. Every ordinary interaction felt staged. Every casual touch felt rehearsed. I realized how often my presence had become optional, how easily my absence had turned into convenience. It wasn't just the affair that hurt. It was the understanding that I had slowly been edited out of my own life. I met with an attorney quietly. I told Emily I had a late meeting and went straight to an office I'd never noticed before, tucked between a dry cleaner and a real estate agency. The conversation was practical, almost sterile. Divorce, I learned, isn't about fairness in the emotional sense. It's about preparation. About documentation. About not being the person who reacts last. We talked timelines, asset division, custody considerations. Infidelity wasn't the dramatic weapon people imagine it to be, but it mattered. It affected leverage. It affected credibility. I took notes on a yellow legal pad and folded it carefully when I left, placing it in the bottom drawer of my desk at home, underneath things Emily never touched because she considered them boring. That night, control almost slipped. I sat at the kitchen table long after everyone was asleep, the house completely silent, staring at the same spot on the wall. My hands were shaking, not from fear, but from the effort of holding everything together. I thought about confronting her. Just ending it. Letting the mess spill out and being done with it. The urge was strong enough that I stood up once, then sat back down. I didn't do it. By morning, the urge was gone. What remained was resolve. Laura was doing the same work on her side. Consulting attorneys. Reviewing documents she had never questioned before. Understanding exactly how much authority Daniel had been borrowing under the assumption it would never be reclaimed. We didn't speak often, but when we did, it was efficient. Timelines. Confirmations. No emotional labor. No second-guessing. The hardest part was pretending nothing had changed. Family dinners continued. Work meetings went on. Plans were made for the following weeks as if the foundation beneath them wasn't already cracking. I realized then how much adult life depends on mutual denial. People sense when something is wrong, but unless forced, they rarely ask. That silence gave us time. Time to prepare. Time to align facts. Time to decide how this would end. The idea of the dinner didn't arrive as a plan. It arrived as a conclusion. A setting familiar enough to lower defenses. A moment ordinary enough to prevent theatrics. Not a trap. Not a spectacle. Just the point where pretending would no longer be possible. By the end of that week, everything that could be prepared was prepared. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't even sad in the way I expected. What I felt was steadiness. The kind that comes when you stop asking why and start deciding what happens next. Once you reach that point, hesitation becomes unnecessary. By the time the plan fully took shape, it no longer felt like retaliation. That was the first thing that surprised me. I had expected anger to drive everything forward, to sit behind every decision like a constant engine. Instead, anger faded early, replaced by something far more reliable. Precision. Once you stop hoping things will return to what they were, you stop wasting energy on impossible outcomes. Laura and I didn't become allies in the dramatic sense of the word. There were no long conversations about how unfair this all was, no mutual validation sessions where pain turned into bonding. What connected us was clarity. We had both crossed the same line independently and arrived at the same conclusion: whatever came next had to be final, clean, and impossible to reinterpret later. Our communication stayed sparse and purposeful. Updates, confirmations, questions that needed answers. Nothing more. We weren't comforting each other. We were coordinating. Emotional processing happened elsewhere, privately, where it couldn't interfere with judgment. The legal preparation became the backbone of everything. I began organizing information the way I did at work when something complicated needed to survive scrutiny. Bank statements went into one folder. Travel records into another. Calendar screenshots, emails, receipts, all labeled, dated, and stored in places that didn't attract attention. I kept everything in a single folder at home, tucked into the bottom drawer of my desk, underneath old manuals and warranty documents Emily had never looked at because she found them tedious. The physical presence of that folder mattered. It made everything tangible. Real. It reminded me that this wasn't a theory or a suspicion anymore. It was documentation. At work, I adjusted my behavior in small but deliberate ways. I made sure decisions were recorded. Processes clarified. Responsibilities mapped. Not loudly, not defensively, just visibly. I wasn't positioning myself for a promotion. I was removing ambiguity. When systems destabilize, ambiguity becomes a liability, and I had no intention of being one. Daniel didn't notice. That confidence of his became almost unsettling to observe. He moved through meetings with the ease of someone who believed the structure around him was permanent. He delegated without concern, made assumptions without verification, trusted that the authority he exercised would always be there. Watching that from the inside was like seeing stress fractures in a building no one else had thought to inspect. Laura's preparation followed a different path, but the same logic. She didn't rush to confront her father. She waited until she understood exactly how the company was structured, how ownership had been distributed, and what conditions had allowed Daniel to operate with such freedom. She gathered facts quietly, the way people do when they know timing matters more than emotion. When she finally spoke to her father, it wasn't a dramatic revelation. It was a briefing. Facts have a way of cutting through sentiment. What became clear was that Daniel's position existed because trust had never been questioned. Once it was, everything else unraveled quickly. Authority built on assumption collapses the moment someone asks for verification. During this time, Emily remained unaware. That was perhaps the hardest part to reconcile. She wasn't acting like someone on the verge of losing everything. If anything, she seemed lighter. More relaxed. As if she believed the version of her life she had constructed was stable and secure. Watching that confidence without reacting to it required discipline I didn't know I had. I realized then that confrontation isn't difficult because it's painful. It's difficult because it's premature. Most confrontations are attempts to regain control through emotion. I wasn't interested in that anymore. The dinner began to feel less like a plan and more like a natural endpoint. Not a setup. Not a trap. Just the moment where parallel stories would be forced into the same room. Familiar space. Familiar people. The kind of environment where no one expects consequences, and therefore can't prepare for them. What mattered most was that everything be finished before that night arrived. No decisions left open. No documents pending. No outcomes dependent on reactions. By the time the invitations went out, there was nothing left to negotiate. I wasn't anxious as the date approached. I didn't rehearse conversations or imagine outcomes. I already knew how it would end. The uncertainty that usually fuels fear had been removed. All that remained was execution. There's a strange calm that comes when you realize you've already done the hardest part. The rest is just timing. The evening arrived quietly. No tension in the air. No warning signs. The house looked exactly the way it always did when we invited people over. Warm light. A clean table. Music low enough to blend into the background without asking for attention. If someone had walked in without context, they would have seen nothing but a familiar gathering, the kind people attend to forget about their week. That normality wasn't accidental. Emily moved through the space comfortably. She poured wine, laughed when she was expected to, rested her hand on my arm in a way that would have meant something before. Watching her do it didn't hurt the way it once would have. It felt detached, like observing a routine after you've already stepped out of the role it was designed for. Daniel looked even more at ease. At work, he was always sharp, always alert. Here, he leaned back, relaxed, certain that whatever walls existed between his lives were still holding. He spoke freely, unconcerned, unaware that the room he was sitting in had already stopped belonging to him. Laura noticed everything. She didn't participate much at first. She listened. She observed. She let the evening move at its own pace. Her calm wasn't hesitation, it was control. She had already finished the part of the process that required emotion. What remained was precision. Time stretched. Food disappeared from plates. Glasses were refilled. Laughter surfaced and faded. The longer the comfort lasted, the heavier it became. Familiarity lowers defenses. That's why we waited. When I stood up to connect my laptop to the television, no one reacted immediately. It felt natural, almost expected, like the start of a slideshow no one thought would matter. I moved slowly, deliberately, using the same steady motions I used at work when presenting reports that affected hundreds of people. The first images were harmless. Old photos. College years. A wedding. Sophie as a child, smiling at the camera with the kind of openness only children have. I let them play long enough for the room to settle into nostalgia, long enough for assumptions to take over. Then the timeline shifted. Recent dates appeared. Locations that overlapped too precisely to be coincidence. Subtle inconsistencies that meant nothing alone and everything together. The room grew quieter, not abruptly, but gradually, as recognition replaced comfort. When the restaurant photo appeared, the illusion ended. I didn't rush. I didn't explain. I let the image sit, followed by others. Receipts. Time stamps. Credit card charges printed late enough to make excuses impossible. Calendar gaps that aligned too well to ignore. Everything arranged cleanly, unemotionally, in an order that removed interpretation from the equation. Laura placed her hand flat on the table as the evidence unfolded, grounding the moment. This wasn't discovery. It was confirmation. Daniel tried to interrupt. Not loudly. Not aggressively. He leaned forward slightly, reaching for the familiar ground of explanation, the tone of someone who believed context could still save him if he framed it correctly. Emily followed instinctively, shifting toward emotion, toward history, toward the idea that feelings could still change outcomes. I stopped it without raising my voice. This wasn't a conversation. It was a conclusion. The room went still. That was the moment the balance shifted visibly. Confidence didn't disappear all at once, it collapsed in stages. Confusion. Calculation. Then the realization that neither would help now. I placed the documents on the table. One set in front of Emily. At the same time, Laura stood and placed an identical set in front of Daniel. Divorce filings. Signed. Dated. Prepared days earlier. The symmetry mattered. Two marriages ending in the same moment, not out of impulse, but preparation. Laura didn't look at Daniel when she did it. Her focus was on the act itself, on finishing something she had already accepted internally. Emily reached the end of the performance she didn't know she'd been giving. Whatever explanations she had prepared were now irrelevant. Explanations only work when decisions are still pending. Daniel finally understood the shape of the room he was in. Authority evaporates quickly when it turns out it was conditional. Borrowed. Temporary. After that, the evening unraveled quietly. Not with chaos, not with shouting, but with inevitability. The kind of ending that doesn't need volume to be effective. Everything that mattered had already happened. Reactions no longer had influence. What stayed with me wasn't their discomfort. It was the stillness Laura and I shared in the final minutes. Two people who had lost something essential, but refused to lose control with it. When I stepped away from the table, it wasn't with satisfaction or regret. It was with certainty. Some endings aren't about punishment. They're about removal. And once that removal is complete, nothing that comes after can undo it. After that night, things moved faster than I expected, but not in the way people imagine. There were no dramatic phone calls, no public fallout, no emotional negotiations stretching into early mornings. Once the structure collapsed, the rest followed with administrative efficiency. Systems don't grieve. They adjust. The divorce process was clean. Not painless, but decisive. Emily moved out within weeks. There were no attempts to reframe what had happened, no long explanations, no last-minute confessions designed to soften the outcome. By the time the paperwork was filed, whatever version of our marriage she had been living in no longer existed on paper or in practice. Sophie handled it better than I feared she would. Children notice instability long before adults are ready to name it. What she needed wasn't a story or justification. She needed consistency. I stayed present. Our routine stayed intact. Whatever had broken between adults didn't spill into her foundation. Daniel's fall was quieter than people might expect. Less than a week after the dinner, he was removed from his position. Not with announcements or scandal, but with finality. Authority built on trust doesn't survive exposure, especially when that trust turns out to be borrowed. Laura's father didn't hesitate once the facts were laid out. There were no second chances. No negotiations. Daniel exited the same way he had operated, through decisions made in rooms he wasn't invited into. Laura reclaimed her life deliberately. She didn't rush into anything new. She stabilized what mattered first: her home, her children, her role in the company her father had built. Ownership remained where it belonged. Control returned to hands that understood its weight. She didn't need revenge. She needed alignment, and she created it. My own transition followed a different path. I didn't take half the company. Laura retained ownership. I stepped into the role Daniel had been borrowing, with a contract that reflected the reality of what I'd already been doing for years. CEO. Long-term incentives. Profit participation tied to performance, not entitlement. No symbolism. No ceremony. Just responsibility matched with authority. The work felt natural. Almost familiar. When you remove instability from the top, everything beneath it breathes easier. Decisions became cleaner. Processes clearer. I wasn't proving myself. I was continuing something that had already been in motion. For a long time, Laura and I lived separate victories. Separate homes. Separate routines. Separate lives rebuilt without urgency. Our conversations were practical at first, limited to work and logistics. There was no rush to redefine anything. We had both learned what happens when people confuse proximity with connection. Over time, the shape of those conversations changed. They moved beyond necessity. Beyond shared history. We started talking about decisions that had nothing to do with the past. About values we had ignored in previous lives because comfort had made us careless. About the kind of stability that doesn't depend on silence or assumption. What connected us wasn't what we had survived. It was what we refused to repeat. Living together wasn't a dramatic leap. It was a measured step taken by two people who had already proven they could stand on their own. There was no performance to maintain. No illusion to protect. Just clarity. Our children adjusted in their own time. Without resistance. Without confusion. As if they sensed that this version of our lives was built on something more honest than what came before. As for Emily, she faded from my daily reality entirely. I saw her once, months later, by coincidence, during a business trip. She had moved closer to her family and taken a job far removed from the life she once talked about wanting. We didn't speak. There was nothing left to resolve. Whatever remained belonged to a version of me that no longer existed. I didn't take satisfaction in her loss. I took satisfaction in my position. My daughter. My work. My stability. A partnership built on choice, not convenience. 2 years earlier, I believed I had lost everything. Looking back now, I understand how wrong that was. What I lost was a life built on assumption and silence. What I gained was something better. Control. Clarity. And, eventually, connection, chosen, not inherited. That's how we won, quietly, and permanently. Thanks for watching. If this story stayed with you, you know what to do. Subscribe.